Beloved, there are moments in our spiritual journey when the Holy Spirit presses upon our hearts a warning, a gentle whisper that becomes a mighty trumpet. Today is such a moment. For too long we have walked casually, unaware that even the things we place on our tables can shape the condition of our soul. There are foods, yes, everyday foods, that carry more than flavor and fragrance. They carry influence. They carry atmosphere. They carry a spiritual weight that can either lift us toward the light or pull us quietly into darkness. Awakening the audience to the unseen spiritual influence behind everyday choices begins with helping them recognize that life is not merely physical, nor are decisions simply logical. Every action carries a ripple in the spiritual realm, though most people walk through their days unaware of these invisible currents. Food, conversations, entertainment, thoughts, and habits all seem ordinary, but each one has the potential to shape the soul in subtle yet profound ways. When people move through life without spiritual alertness, they allow these influences to pass unchecked, gradually forming patterns that shape their character, weaken their discernment, or open pathways they never intended to walk. This awakening is not meant to instill fear, but to stir awareness, a realization that the spiritual world is active and our daily choices are not neutral. Many individuals live as though spiritual danger is found only in dramatic, obvious moments, yet the most significant shifts in a person's spiritual condition often occur through small, repeated decisions. A single compromise may seem harmless, but repeated exposure to spiritually dulling influences slowly numbs the inner senses. Likewise, even food, something as basic as what we consume, can become symbolic, carrying cultural, emotional, or spiritual meanings that influence how the mind and heart respond. Some foods may serve as reminders of past bondage, certain environments, or rituals once tied to practices that drew the soul away from the light. When people fail to recognize these connections, they unknowingly maintain ties that pull them backward. To awaken the audience, you must guide them to see that discernment is not only for dramatic spiritual battles, but for the quiet routines of life. The unseen realm interacts constantly with our physical existence, and becoming spiritually mature requires awareness of these subtle points of contact. This awakening helps listeners understand that the spiritual life is woven through the ordinary moments, the meals they eat, the words they speak, the emotions they hold, and the environments they tolerate. When the audience realizes that the enemy often approaches through the familiar and the comfortable rather than the frightening, they begin to understand why vigilance is necessary. Bringing people to this awareness requires a tone of compassion and clarity. You lead them to feel both the seriousness and the hope contained in this revelation. They must sense that they are not helpless beings tossed in a spiritual struggle, but empowered individuals who can choose wisely when their eyes are opened. Once this awakening begins, people recognize the depth of meaning behind their daily decisions, and they feel a renewed desire to guard their hearts and minds, understanding that the unseen world shapes the visible one in ways they cannot afford to ignore. Highlighting the subtlety of spiritually harmful habits, especially through food as symbolic gateways, requires drawing attention to quiet, almost unnoticeable ways the spiritual realm interacts with daily life. The greatest dangers are rarely loud or dramatic. They are gentle, familiar, hidden beneath routine. People often assume that spiritual threats come wrapped in darkness and obvious evil, yet more often they come through what feels ordinary. A plate of food, a family tradition, a craving, or an emotional attachment to certain meals can become a doorway, not because the food itself holds power, but because of what it is tied to in heart, the memory, or the atmosphere it was once connected with. Spiritual harm often begins with symbolism rather than substance. meaning that the danger lies not in the physical item, but in what it represents on a deeper level. Many individuals underestimate how easily small habits shape their inner life. A behavior repeated without awareness can grow roots, forming attachments that cloud spiritual clarity. Something as simple as turning to certain foods for emotional comfort can create a pattern of dependency that replaces spiritual reliance with physical gratification. When this happens, the heart begins to lean away from divine strength and towards something that offers temporary satisfaction. Over time, small choices accumulate, building invisible walls between the person and their spiritual sensitivity. This subtle shift rarely announces itself. Instead, it begins with a quiet compromise that grows stronger with each repetition. The subtlety becomes even more potent when food is connected to past environments, rituals, or practices that once carried unhealthy spiritual meaning. Foods tied to old beliefs, past addictions, or cultural rituals that conflict with spiritual truth may seem harmless on the surface, yet they can stir memories or emotions that reopen spiritual vulnerabilities. Without recognizing this connection, a person might unknowingly invite old patterns back into their life. The danger lies in familiarity. The mind says, "It's just food," while the spirit feels the pull of something deeper. These symbolic gateways are rarely recognized until one becomes spiritually alert enough to sense the atmosphere surrounding certain choices. This is why spiritual discernment must penetrate beyond the physical appearance of things. Discernment allows a person to recognize when something carries weight beyond its visible form. A spiritually harmful habit often begins as a small preference, an emotional comfort, or a cultural tradition embraced without examination. Over time, this habit can dull the inner senses, making it harder to hear divine direction or resist negative influences. The subtlety lies in how natural it feels. There is no immediate harm, no sudden shift, no clear sign of danger. Instead, it is the slow erosion of spiritual sharpness that makes these habits so dangerous. To highlight the subtlety of these influences, one must guide people to pay attention to what their spirit feels rather than what their eyes see. They must learn to notice the quiet tug, the inner unease, the slight heaviness that comes with certain actions. When individuals begin to observe these subtle signals, they realize that spiritual danger often hides in the familiar. Awakening to this truth empowers them to break cycles that once seemed harmless and to choose habits that strengthen rather than weaken their spiritual foundation, stirring urgency in the hearts of listeners is essential because spiritual danger often goes unnoticed until it has already taken root. People naturally drift into comfort, assuming that if something feels harmless today, it will remain harmless tomorrow. But spiritual decline rarely arrives suddenly. It grows slowly, quietly, waiting for complacency to open the door. Urgency, therefore, is not about spreading fear, but about awakening the soul to recognize that spiritual vigilance cannot be postponed. When someone realizes the importance of acting now, examining habits now, discerning influences now, making changes now, they take back authority over areas where they may have unknowingly surrendered ground. The challenge lies in the subtle nature of spiritual erosion. Without urgency, people normalize what weakens them. They excuse small compromises because nothing appears to change immediately. But spiritual danger does not always manifest in a single dramatic event. Often it reveals itself gradually through a growing heaviness, a weakening of conviction, or a dimming of spiritual passion. Urgency forces the listener to confront this reality before the consequences fully unfold. It reminds them that time is not neutral. Every day spent in spiritual passivity strengthens the hold of negative influences and weakens the resolve to break free. Instilling urgency also allows individuals to see that spiritual protection is not automatic. It requires intention. It requires awareness. It requires the willingness to examine habits, beliefs, and patterns with honesty and humility. Many people remain bound not because they choose darkness, but because they delay addressing the subtle things that pull them away from light. When urgency is awakened, hesitation loses its power. A person begins to act decisively, cutting off influences that once felt harmless but are now recognized as spiritually draining. This urgency must come wrapped in hope, not condemnation. It must remind listeners that the moment they choose awareness, clarity returns. The moment they confront what they once ignored, their spirit begins to rise again. The call to act is not a burden but an invitation to freedom, protection, and renewal. When people feel the weight of the present moment, when they sense that this is the time to examine what they consume, what they allow, and what they tolerate, they awaken to the responsibility and privilege of guarding their spiritual life with seriousness. By stirring this urgency, individuals become more attentive to the quiet signals within their spirit. They stop dismissing the uneasiness they feel around certain choices and start recognizing it as a warning meant for their protection. Urgency transforms passive listeners into active participants in their own spiritual well-being, ready to address the subtle dangers before they become strongholds that are harder to break. Connecting physical consumption to spiritual consequences requires helping people understand that the human being is not divided into compartments. The body, mind, and spirit are intertwined in ways that influence one another constantly. What enters the body does not remain purely physical, because every act of consumption carries intention, memory, emotion, and atmosphere. Food is more than a biological necessity. It is often tied to experiences, cultural rituals, and emotional moments that imprint themselves on the inner life. When someone eats something connected to past struggles, harmful environments, or unhealthy spiritual practices, the act can stir dormant emotions or memories that weaken spiritual strength. This connection does not occur because the food itself holds supernatural power, but because the heart responds to what the food symbolizes or recalls. Physical consumption also affects the mind, and the mind shapes the condition of the spirit. For example, turning to food as a source of comfort rather than confronting emotional or spiritual emptiness can form unhealthy dependencies. Instead of facing pain, fear, or loneliness, a person may repeatedly use food to silence what the spirit is trying to surface. This creates a disconnect, dulling spiritual sensitivity and replacing spiritual reliance with physical gratification. Over time, this pattern shapes the heart, making it less responsive to spiritual prompting. The physical act becomes a doorway to deeper spiritual consequences. In addition, certain foods may be tied to environments that carry negative spiritual atmospheres. Meals associated with past addictions, harmful relationships, or cultural rituals can evoke the weight of those memories. When consumed without awareness, they can subtly reopen emotional or spiritual vulnerabilities that a person worked hard to overcome. The spirit often reacts before the mind understands, creating a sense of heaviness, confusion, or inner resistance. Recognizing this connection allows individuals to understand that not every physical choice is neutral. The spiritual consequences emerge not from superstition, but from the way human nature integrates physical experiences with emotional and spiritual reality. Furthermore, the The discipline of consumption can either strengthen or weaken spiritual resilience. Learning to say no to certain foods or choosing to break free from familiar cravings tied to unhealthy patterns trains the spirit in self-control, clarity, and sensitivity. Every physical decision becomes an opportunity to exercise spiritual authority. Conversely, allowing physical habits to dominate the inner life diminishes that authority, causing the spirit to yield to impulses rather than guiding them. Understanding this relationship encourages a deeper level of wisdom and discernment. It teaches that physical choices carry spiritual ripples, shaping the atmosphere of the heart, influencing focus, and affecting the ability to remain spiritually alert. When people grasp this truth, they begin to make decisions with greater care, recognizing the profound connection between what they consume and the condition of their spirit.